Okay, this next lesson is the skeletal system is going to be on joints. And joints are also known as articulations, and basically they exist anywhere that two bones meet and come together. Now, we usually think of joints as being movable, and that's what we're going to focus on, but the structure of the joint actually determines what movement we have, if any. For example, the skull sutures, where our skull bones come together. That's a joint that actually permits very little movement, whereas the shoulder has a very wide range of movement. Now, joints can be classified both based on their structure as well as their function. And when we talk about function, we are talking about their range of motion. With structural classification of joints, we're not going to spend a ton of time on, but I do want to go through the three. That's actually based on the anatomy of the particular joint, and we have three types. The first two are very similar to each other. The first one is a fibrous joint. In other words, the connective tissue that actually joins the two bones together is fibrous, and this permits no movement or slight movement. The second one basically has the same range of motion, but the connective tissue is different. It's cartilaginous, hence the name. Now, if I were to give you a joint that had no movement or slight movement and asked you to classify it based on its structure, it probably would be very difficult because unless you had a microscope, you really couldn't necessarily tell whether it was fibrous connective tissue or cartilaginous connective tissue. The third type of joint is the synovial joint, and that is surrounded by fibrous tissue, which again sounds very similar to the first one, but they do permit free movement, which makes it very unique from the other two. Now, the functional classification of joints is based on their range of motion. So again, how they work. And we have three types that we're going to go through: the Synarthroses, the Amphiarthrosis, and the Diarthroses. The Synarthroses are the immovable joints where the edges of the bones are either very close together or interlocking. Kind of think of it like when you interlock your fingers and fold them over the opposite hand. Okay, you can't really move them side to side very easily. Examples of a synarthrotic joint is between the bones of the skull as well as between the teeth and the jaws. Amphiarthroses are slightly movable joints. They have bones that are further apart than in a synarthrosis. And examples of an amphiarthrosis are between the tibia and fibula, between our adjacent vertebrae, and between the left and right halves of the pelvis, which does move, especially during childbirth. Now, with Synarthroses and Amphiarthroses, because the bones are so close together, with all of the connective tissue and coverings that we have over our body, it makes it really hard for us to study these two types of joints. We're actually going to spend most of our time talking about the Diarthroses. Now, the Diarthroses have another name that you've actually already heard. They are also known as synovial joints, and that's usually how I refer to these, just because it's easier to say synovial, and a lot of the terminology associated with these joints actually uses the word synovial. These joints provide a very wide range of motion, and there's some common features of a diarthrotic joint. They are made of a joint capsule, which is a fibrous boundary that actually defines where the joint actually is. And the ends of the bone that are involved in the joint are covered with an articular cartilage. This helps prevent the bones from actually kind of grinding on each other. The cavity between the two bones is filled with a synovial fluid, which provides lubrication and reduces friction. Now, there are some features of a joint that aren't always present. It just depends on the joint. And one of those is what we call a meniscus, which is basically a cartilage pad. You guys probably know one that we have in our knee, so that's one that's very familiar. There's also fat pads that are there, and again, those provide additional cushioning as well. Now, all joints have ligaments, and the ligaments that join the bones can be either inside or outside of the joint capsule. Again, that depends on the particular joint. Some of them will have them inside, and some of them will have them outside. A joint may or may not also have something called a bursa or bursae, which is the plural. And these are basically just small little connective tissue packets. You can kind of think of them as like little pillows, and they're filled, instead of with like nice fluffy feathers, they're filled with synovial fluid. And because they contain that synovial fluid, it functions very much like just little portable pockets of synovial fluid. They reduce friction, and then they also act as shock absorbers. These form near the tendons and ligaments because these actually override the bone in a lot of places. And again, they can cause friction between the bone and the ligament or tendon, so we want to do that. We want to try to also relieve pressure using these bursae. Now, this is a generalized diagram of a joint. Doesn't really exist in the body. And you can see here that the periosteum, the outer covering of the bone, lies contiguously or continuously here with the blue of the joint capsule. So it looks like one continuous membrane. You really can't tell the difference. On the inside here where the pink is the synovial membrane, and that produces the fluid that lies in between the bones. You've got the articular cartilage capping each bone, again to help prevent them from grinding against each other. And notice that we have this line here in the bone. That's a closed epiphyseal plate. So this obviously these are bones that have stopped growing, but that's kind of the line that is left behind. Now we have some diseases that actually take place at our joints, and the most general one is called rheumatism. And rheumatism is kind of one of those catch-all terms. Rheumatism basically refers to any sort of pain or stiffness that's associated with the skeletal or muscular system. So we have a very wide range of different things that we call rheumatism. We're going to focus on several of the major forms of rheumatism that you might be familiar with. The first one is arthritis, and arthritis includes all of the rheumatism that affects synovial joints. So any pain or stiffness that's around a synovial joint is classified as arthritis. What happens with arthritis is the articular cartilage actually gets damaged. And there's many different ways that this can happen. It can be from a bacterial or a viral infection. You can actually damage the joint itself. There can be a metabolic problem, such as gout, where we have uric acid that actually builds up in our joints, or you can have severe physical stress. Different aspects of certain people's jobs, puts a lot of stress on their joints, and this can actually damage the cartilage. The second type of disease or rheumatism is osteoarthritis, and this is also known as a degenerative joint disease. In other words, it starts and then it gets worse with time. It usually affects people that are 60 or older, and there's no necessarily one root cause. It's usually because of cumulative wear and tear, just the abuses that we put on our joints as we move through life. But some people tend to get it a little bit more than others, and they've actually found a genetic link between this disease and people who get it. It's pretty widespread. It affects about 25% of women and 15% of men who are over the age of 60. The last type of rheumatism that we're going to look at is rheumatoid arthritis. And this is an inflammatory joint condition that's actually caused by the immune system. Now, what happens with this is that the immune system actually kind of goes haywire and it attacks the tissues of our joints. Now, normally the immune system attacks bad things like bacteria or viruses, but sometimes it overreacts, like when we get an allergy. And in this case, it overreacts and actually starts attacking our healthy tissue. So what can happen is that some of these types of things that normally trigger the immune system can also trigger an attack of rheumatoid arthritis. Now, people who get rheumatoid arthritis can undergo treatment, and they include things like exercise to help keep the joints healthy, physical therapy, again, to do the same. Anti-inflammatory drugs can help reduce the swelling. And some people with severe rheumatoid arthritis actually undergo surgical joint realignment because sometimes those joint capsules get so inflamed it actually kind of pushes things out of alignment. Or they can actually replace the bones around that joint so that there's no living tissue there to attack, because that pain is caused by the homeostasis of those cells getting disrupted. Now, people can get shoulder replacements, hip replacements, knee replacements. Hip and knee are pretty successful for a very long period of time. Shoulders are as well, but they usually only last about 15 years. And once you've had one shoulder replacement, you can't have another one. So sometimes people who are looking to get a shoulder replacement will kind of push it off until later in life, because if they get it too young, the replacement may actually wear out just like the original parts did. So anyway, in our next segment here, we're going to go through the types of joint movement that we have, and also talk about how we classify them.